The Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-21 is a supersonic jet fighter and interceptor aircraft. Designed by Mikoyan Gurevich Design Bureau in the Soviet Union, its nicknames include Balalaika, because its plan form resembles a stringed musical instrument of the same name. Orlowek, Polish for pencil due to the shape of its fuselage, and Anbak, meaning silver swallow in Vietnamese. Approximately 60 countries across 4 continents have flown the MiG-21, and it still serves many nations 7 decades after its maiden flight. It set aviation records, becoming the most produced supersonic jet aircraft in aviation history, the most produced combat aircraft since the Korean War, and previously the longest production run of any combat aircraft. The MiG-21 jet fighter was a continuation of Soviet jet fighters, starting with the subsonic MiG-15 and MiG-17, and supersonic MiG-19, as a number of experimental Mach 2 Soviet designs were based on nose intakes with either swept-back wings, such as the Sukhoi Su-7, or tailed deltas, of which the MiG-21 would be the most successful. Development of what would become the MiG-21 began in the early 1950s when Mikoyan OKB finished a preliminary design study for a prototype designated YE-1 in 1954. This project was very quickly reworked when it was determined that the planned engine was underpowered. The redesign led to a second prototype of the YE-2. Both these and other early prototypes featured swept wings. The first prototype with the delta wings found on production variants was the YE-4. It made its maiden flight on the 16th of June 1955, and its first public appearance during the Soviet Aviation Day display at Moscow's Tushino Airfield in July 1956. In the West, due to the lack of available information, early details of the MiG-21 often were confused with those of similar Soviet fighters of the era. In one instance, Jane's All the World aircraft, 1960 to 1961, listed the quote-unquote fish bed as a Sukhoi design and used an illustration of the Sukhoi 9 fish pot. The MiG-21 was the first successful Soviet aircraft combining fighter and interceptor characteristics in a single aircraft. It was a lightweight fighter, achieving Mach 2 with relatively low-powered afterburning turbojet, and is thus comparable to the American Lockheed F-104 Starfighter and Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighter and the French Dassault Mirage 3. Its basic layout was used for numerous other Soviet designs. Delta-winged aircraft included the Su-9 Interceptor and the fast E-150 prototype from the MiG Bureau, while successful mass-produced frontline fighters Su-7 and Mikoyan's I-75 experimental interceptor combined a similar fuselage shape with swept-back wings. However, the characteristic layout with the shock cone and the front air intake did not see widespread use outside the USSR and ultimately proved to have a limited development potential, mainly due to the small available space for the radar. Like many aircraft designed as interceptors, the MiG-21 had a short range. This was exacerbated by poor placement of the internal fuel tanks ahead of the center of gravity. As the internal fuel was consumed, the center of gravity would shift rearward beyond acceptable parameters. This had the effect of making the plane statically unstable to the point of being difficult to control, resulting in an endurance of only 45 minutes in clean condition. This can be somewhat countered by carrying fuel in external tanks closer to the center of gravity. The Chinese variant somewhat improved the internal fuel tank layout, as did the second generation of Soviet variants, and also carried significantly larger external fuel tanks to counter this issue. Additionally, when more than half the fuel was used up, violent maneuvers prevented fuel from flowing into the engine, thereby causing it to shut down in flight. This increased the risk of tank implosions, a problem inherited from MiG-15, 17, and 19. The short endurance and low fuel capacity of the MiG-21F, PF, PFM, S, SM, and M and MF variants though each had a somewhat greater fuel capacity than its predecessor, led to the development of the MT and SMT variants. These had an increased range of 250 kilometers or 155 miles compared to the MiG-21 SM, but at the cost of worsening all other performance figures such as lower service ceiling and lowered time to altitude. The Delta Wing, while excellent for fast climbing interceptor, meant any form of turning combat led to a rapid loss of speed. However, the light loading of the aircraft would mean that a climb rate of 235 meters a second, or 46,200 feet a minute, was possible with the combat-loaded MiG-21 BIS. Not far short of the performance of the later F-16A. MiG-21's Timensky R-25 jet engine specialty was the addition of a second fuel pump in the afterburning stage. Activating the booster features allowed the engine to develop 97.4 kilonewtons, or 21,896 pounds of thrust under 2,000 meters, 6,600 feet of altitude. The RPM of the engine would increase by 2.5%, and the compression ratio would thus increase, with a rise in exhaust temperature. The limit of operation is 2 minutes for both practice and actual wartime use, as further use causes the engine to overheat. Fuel consumption increased by 50% over the rate in full afterburner. Use of this temporary power gave the MiG-21 BIS slightly better than 1-to-1 thrust-to-weight ratio and climbing rate of 254 meters a second, equaling the F-16's nominal capabilities in close-quarters dogfight. Use of WEP thrust was limited to 2 minutes to reduce stress on the engine's 750 flight hours of lifetime, since every second of the super afterburner counted as several minutes of regular power run due to extreme thermal stress. With WEP on, the MiG-21 BIS R-25 engines produced a huge 10 to 12 meter long blowtorch exhaust, with 6 or 7 brightly glowing rhomboid shock diamonds visible inside the exhaust. The Russians gave the emergency power setting its quote-unquote diamond regime, name never used in India. Given a skilled pilot and capable missiles, it could give a good account of itself against contemporary fighters. Its G limits were increased from 7 Gs in initial variants to plus 8.5 Gs in the latest variants. It was replaced by the newer variable geometry MiG-23 and MiG-27 for ground support duties. However, not until the MiG-29 would the Soviet Union ultimately replace the MiG-21 as a maneuvering dogfighter to counter new American superiority types. MiG-21 was exported widely and remains in use. The aircraft's simple controls, engine, weapons, and avionics were typical of the Soviet-era military designs. The use of a tail with delta wing aids stability and control at the extremes of the flight envelope, enhancing safety for lower-skilled pilots. This in turn enhances its marketability and exports to developing countries with limited training programs and restricted pilot pools. While technologically inferior to the more advanced fighters it often faced, low production and maintenance costs made it a favorite of nations buying Eastern Bloc military hardware. Several Russian, Israeli, and Romanian firms have begun to offer upgrade packages to MiG-21 operators designed to bring the aircraft up to a modern standard with greatly upgraded avionics and armaments. A total of 10,645 aircraft were built in the USSR. They were produced in 3 factories, AZ-30 in Moscow, GAZ-21 in Gorky, and TAZ-31 in Tbilisi. Generally, Gorky built single-seaters for the Soviet forces, Moscow constructed single-seaters for export, and Tbilisi manufactured 2-seaters for both export and the USSR, though there were exceptions. The MiG-21R and the MiG-21 BIS for export and for the USSR were built in Gorky. 17 single-seaters were built in Tbilisi. The MiG-21 MF was first constructed in Moscow and then Gorky, and the MiG-21U was built in Moscow as well as in Tbilisi. A total of 194 MiG-21Fs 13s were built under license in Czechoslovakia, and Hindustan Aeronautics of India built 657 MiG-21FL, MiG-21M, and MiG-21 BIS. Due to the mass production, the aircraft was very cheap. The MiG-21MF, for example, was cheaper than a BMP-1. The F-4 Phantom's cost was several times higher than the MiG-21.